Hi guys, this is Weasel. Welcome to the 6th video in the Beating the Micro series. Hopefully you had a chance to check out the article which was talking about 3-betting and the different types of situations you want to be 3-betting and the kind of ranges you want to be 3-betting with also. In general, it will be a matter of style, which hands you choose to 3-bet, 4-bet or 5-bet with. Some players like to make re-raises pre-flop at every possible opportunity, whereas other players, myself included, have a tendency to try and see flops, and there are two reasons for this. One, it is often going to be lower variance to see a flop rather than re-raise pre-flop. And the second reason is there is typically more skill involved playing in post-flop situations than getting involved in pre-flop wars, and we can expect to generate an edge this way. Today we are going to be concluding our hand history review. We are looking at a slightly different session, and we are going to be considering the biggest pots won and the biggest pots lost. To kick off the action, we have pocket queens in middle position, which is a standard open raise. The small blind, who is playing 36-17 so far, makes the call. The flop is obviously quite nice for us. We flop second set. And we are definitely going to be c-betting on this board for value. There are worse hands the small blind can continue with, perhaps any ace-x type hand, perhaps any gut shot such as king-jack, king-10, maybe even a strong hand like pocket eights. Maybe he also has some queen-x type hands like king-queen, although these are less likely given that there are only one queen left in the deck. We do c-bet and we do get check min raised. If he is doing this with a hand like ace-10 or ace-jack or even ace-king, it doesn't necessarily make a huge amount of sense. If we are c-betting this board as a bluff, which we may well do, we could expect to have reasonable fold equity on this ace-high board. If we are c-betting it as a bluff, he is probably folding out most of our bluffs by making this raise here. We do, however, expect this to be a value raise. I think it's possible he will raise slightly larger as a bluff. I would guess his range could be anything from ace-jack to ace-king, maybe ace-queen, maybe a hand like pocket eights, or maybe even a hand like ace-8 suited that he's calling with in the small blind. However, just in case he is bluffing, given the fact we aren't scared of too many turns or river cards, we are going to flat here, and especially since we're in position, we can see if he then continues firing on the turn. This way, if he is bluffing or even semi-bluffing with a hand like king-10, he now has the opportunity to fire the turn with these hands. He does check the turn, which leads me to suspect he possibly doesn't have a very strong made hand like a set. I think he is definitely continue firing on this board. He may have some weak value hands. We are definitely going to bet and hope he does have a hand like ace-jack or ace-queen. Although we'd expect him some of the time to continue firing on the turn. Although with these hands his flop play doesn't make much sense. Given that he checks the river to us, he pretty much never has a better hand here. I think he's definitely check raising the turn, or maybe even donking the turn with a hand like 10-jack. I think strong made sets are unlikely. I think pocket eights, he's definitely not getting to the river this way. When he checks the river to us, his range really looks like some ace-x type hands. Maybe occasionally a slightly stronger ace-x type hand like ace-queen or ace-8, or maybe even a turned ace-9. We definitely want to try and get value from this range. I think overbetting this river value would be a bit ambitious, given we don't expect him to be super strong ever. We can still bet reasonably big. We make it just over 2/3 pot, which is fine. And he calls and shows the ace-9, so he did spike 2-pair on the turn. His flop play was not very good, however, in my opinion. He's really isolating himself against better hands a lot of the time with his flop check min raise. Perhaps he hopes that I can sometimes peel with a gut shot myself, or maybe even a queen x type hand. But I don't like his flop play. Pocket aces under the gun, we open raise to 4x, which is standard, and we get 3-bet by the button, who is possibly a fish. We still expect, in all the range of possible hands he is 3-betting here, that when someone 3-bets versus an under the gun open, we do expect them to be slightly stronger than their average 3-bet. I definitely think 4-betting here, hoping to get more money in the pot, is a good idea. He can easily have a strong hand here that he doesn't want to fold, such as ace-queen plus or maybe jacks plus. And when he jams over the top, we obviously have a very easy decision with our pocket aces, and it's a standard cooler. Next hand we have pocket aces from the small blind. The button open raises, and so far it seems as if he has been stealing reasonably wide. He has been 3-bet once and he didn't fold, therefore we can definitely 3-bet for value here, and hope he is the kind of player who likes to continue to a lot of 3-bets, especially in position. The flop is very dry, and you can do two things here. Given that the flop is dry and you do have the redraw to the diamond flush, so if the turn comes a diamond you aren't as worried because you have the redraw. Given that there aren't too many hands he can have, we can definitely slow play in this situation. I do prefer betting most of the time, and when you do bet in this situation, the important thing to realize is you don't need to bet big. You are trying to induce floats from hands like ace-jack or maybe pocket fives, so there is no need to bet super huge. Given the board is dry, it is fine to check with the intention of check calling. The reason being, when we check on this board, we do represent that we perhaps have a hand like ace-queen or ace-jack, and we have missed this board. We can expect him to try and take the pot down a reasonable amount of the time on such a board. We do check call, continuing to represent that we have a hand with marginal showdown value, maybe some types of ace-high type hand. The turn goes check-check. The diamond flush does get there on the turn. He doesn't necessarily have to have diamonds. I think he's probably going to bet this flop with a reasonable amount of his range. When the river comes a 4, we pretty much have the nuts. It's also unlikely that if he did have a 9x type hand, he is probably not going to fold it. He no longer has to worry about kicker issues. If he has a hand like 9-10, he doesn't need to worry that his kicker is no good, because he has a full boat. Also, if he did have a hand like 9x, perhaps something like ace-9 or 9-10, and he bets the flop for value, he may definitely check back this deuce of diamonds turn with the worry that we are check calling the flop with our flush draws. But when this river comes a 4, he has filled up with his pair type hands, and therefore he doesn't need to worry about the flush either. We make a bet for value. Perhaps you are familiar with a theorem known as Zebo's theorem, which is no one ever folds a full house. Even if he has a hand like pocket fives, I definitely think we're getting paid off here. And we make it small enough that if he does have a hand like 9x, or even some better over pairs, it's quite likely he is going to re-raise here. And he does re-raise, and we shove. The reason being he's never folding a 9x type hand here. If he did re-raise with a hand like pocket 8s or 7s, which he shouldn't be doing really, he's probably not folding these either, given the price he's now getting. And he does end up having pocket 2s. Therefore, it's quite fortunate for us that the turn went check-check. I'm not sure if he realizes that his hand has actually been counterfeited here. He only actually has a pair of 2s, because there are 3 4s on the board, so therefore his 3 2s are counterfeited. His hand is 4 4 4 deuce deuce. He doesn't have a set anymore. Given how the river play went, I don't think he realized that he'd been counterfeited. We have pocket 7s in the small blind, and I flat. And we do flop a set. Given that I think he is going to be c-betting this board very often, even with his hands like pocket 8s, pocket 10s, I am going to check to him and let him c-bet. If I donk bet, there aren't really too many draws I can get value from, and he may be folding a hand like pocket 10s to a donk bet. He will probably still call with his ace-x type hands if I donk bet, but he is definitely c-betting his ace-x type hands on the flop anyway. We decide to check call. I don't think there's too much reason to check raise here. We don't want to allow him to correctly fold a hand like ace-jack or ace-10, maybe even queen-king. He may continue barreling some of these hands. The turn comes a 10, which does coordinate the board, and I think this is a good situation to raise. The reason we want to raise here is not necessarily because we are scared of being sucked out on. If he does have a hand like Jack-Queen, he pretty much has around 4 outs, maybe 8% equity. If he has a 2-pair type hand like Ace-Queen or Ace-10, he again has 4 outs and pretty much has 8% equity. So the reason we are raising on this turn is not because we are worried about getting sucked out on. The reason we want to raise is because there are scare cards that can come on the river for him. For example, if the river comes any jack or king, he may not want to get the stacks in anymore because he's now scared of that 1-card straight draw. Even if the river comes something like a 10 or a queen or even an ace, he may be folding some of his 2-pair type hands, the ones that didn't make a boat. So we are really raising here because there are quite a few scare cards that can hit the river and we don't want to lose value. We are not in the slightest bit worried about being sucked out on here. If he does have a hand like pocket aces or pocket queens, then this is fine. We are going to get the money in. And he does jam. We do have a set, and he can easily have a hand like ace-queen or ace-10. Therefore, we are definitely stacking off here. Ace King from middle position, standard open raise. We get called by the button, who is playing reasonably tight so far, 22-17 over 1.2k hands. The thing to notice about this player is he has a very high flop raise. His flop check raise is 21% so far out of 34 opportunities. And presumably, while this stat doesn't directly deal with flop raising, if he's check raising that much out of position, he's probably raising the flop in position, perhaps even more frequently than he's check raising the flop. This is a very high check raise stat to have, 21%. He's definitely making plays light on the flop. It's not perhaps the greatest board to c-bet. We could perhaps sometimes consider check calling on this board if we think he's firing the flop light. I'm not necessarily convinced he is. Given that we have ace king, c-betting is often going to be okay. It would usually be better to c-bet if we perhaps had the ace of diamonds or the king of diamonds. This way we'd find ourselves with some profitable barreling opportunities. There are still a reasonable amount of cards we can fire on the turn. We're definitely firing any ace or king. We may be even able to fire perhaps cards like jack or queen as other over cards and hope to fold him off his flush draws or worse over pairs. We do make the c-bet and he raises, and obviously, as we were saying, this guy is probably just going to be light here a huge amount of the time. He can easily be raising a worse hand. He can of course be sometimes raising a hand for value. He's definitely raising a set for value here. He may even be raising some of his overpairs for value here. But a huge amount of the time he can just have random cards here. He might be doing this with something like Queen Jack. Perhaps he even has something slightly stronger, such as an ace x of diamonds. And we are ahead of most of his ace x hands since we have the ace king. There's pretty much a very good chance that we actually have the best hand here. Also, it's possible he can call with worse if he does have a strong draw. If we re-raise this flop and he does end up having a hand like pocket eights, we do in fact still have reasonable equity. I therefore decide to jam the flop. And I do expect to sometimes get called by worse. Sometimes I take the pot down. And he ends up having the ace-5 of diamonds. So given the fact that he has a flush draw and a gut shot, he is actually a slight favourite. I think I have around 45% equity. However, given the money that was already in the pot, this play worked out fine. Hopefully we don't expect him to have a hand this strong. Some of the time he can maybe have a hand like ace queen with the flush draw without the gut shot. Perhaps you could maybe consider not shoving the flop and perhaps make a smaller raise. The downside to making a smaller raise is perhaps you open yourself up to being rebluffed. Also, there may be some turn cards where your decision is not quite so straightforward. If you did, however, choose to raise small on the flop, it would probably be with the intention of firing quite a lot of turn cards for your fold equity. So the flop raise in itself was not really purely for value. It's more of a semi-bluff with equity. We are more than happy just to take the pot down with that ace king. given that we think he is raising the flop light a reasonable amount. Our hand's not really quite strong enough to consider check calling the flop out of position. And when we do shove and we do get called, we expect to a lot of the time still have reasonable equity, as we do in this case, and as we would against a hand like pocket eights, and he can even call with worse hands some of the time. So this is obviously not a standard play to be making. We made this play only because he has shown a tendency to play back so wide on the flop. The standard play is usually just to fold ace-king to the flop raise. And we do hold up, which is nice, but not that relevant. We have pocket aces in the small blinds. The cut-off open raises, who we have a reasonable amount of hands on, who seems to be an aggressive regular. And the button calls, who seems to be tighter, and also a regular, playing 16-11. We decide to make a 3-bet for value, and we get 4-bet. It is definitely possible this player can be 4-betting light, given that he is aggressive. However, most of the time he is folding to 3-bets. It's also very possible he can have a strong value hand here. Flatting here is definitely a possible option. Either way, the money is likely going in, and if we flat the 4-bet, we are pretty much never folding post-flop. It's just a case of helping to keep in the bluff part of his range when he does 4-bet by flatting, and allowing him to fire some c-bets on the flop in a 4-bet pot. I guess in this particular case, I just felt, given there is this IREG 87 player to act behind, that he is not 4-betting light, and he likely has part of his value range, and he's probably not folding to a 5-bet, so I just shove with the pocket aces. So pocket aces in the big blind, the button, who is short stacked, open limps, and the small blind, who is playing 26-12 over 2.2k hands, raises it to 4x. He hasn't been raising too much, 12% of the time, probably less from the small blinds. We should therefore expect him to be raising for value here. He also has a low fault of 3-bet stat. We definitely want to make a 3-bet here for value. And he 4-bets us. It's very likely he has a hand like pocket kings, maybe even ace-king. We are just going to shove for value. Pocket nines from the button. We make a standard open raise. The player in the big blind 3-bets us. I think I had some reason to suspect this player was light, and was also possibly either crazy or on tilt. I can't remember what led me to that conclusion, but I definitely decided I was going to 4-bet this hand with the intention of calling a shove. I think he may fold a decent amount of time to the 4-bet, and I also think he is capable of shoving worse hands over the 4-bet, maybe even lower pocket pairs, and also of course hands like ace-jack, ace-queen, ace-king, which we are a slight favourite against, and we can never fold given the money in the pot. We shouldn't generally ever be 4-bet folding a hand like pocket nines. There are much better hands to turn into a bluff. We may as well 4-bet fold with a hand like king 6 suited. He does flat out 4-bet, and we did discuss this in a previous video. Some players will only ever be doing this with a hand like kings or aces. The only times they flatter 4-bet is when they are slow playing. Given what I suspected about this guy, his range can easily be much wider than this. He can have anything like ace 10 plus. He can have a hand like pocket 8s. He can have maybe some hands like Jack King, Jack Queen suited that he really shouldn't be calling with. Given this range, it's quite likely we are ahead. We definitely want to c-bet the flop. We don't want to bet too big. There aren't really too many worse hands he can call with. We definitely want him to continue some of the time, maybe if he has overcards. It's fine if he folds these hands also. What we don't want to do is isolate ourselves against a range we don't do well against by betting big here. But given the reads I had on this player, I think we don't need to worry about that too much. I c-bet around half pot, and he jams. If we think about what his range looks like here, if he has a hand like pocket queens, kings or aces here, is he really ever check shoving the flop? It might well be high EV for him to check call with a hand like pocket kings. We could even be 4-betting light. We can have some bluffs in our range. It would likely be higher EV for him to let us barrel with a hand like ace king. I don't know if he's necessarily thinking on this level. I do think in general this does look quite bluffy. I think the same applies with hands like pocket 3s, 5s or 6s. If he's flatting our 4-bet with those, I think he's probably going to be calling here rather than shoving all in. There is every chance that we ourselves have missed this flop, and he is just going to be folding out a hand like ace king, perhaps a lot of the time, by jamming here. This looks like a bluff with equity, perhaps a hand like ace king himself, or maybe ace jack, or maybe something like jack queen of clubs, where he wants to get in with his draw with reasonable fold equity. I think it's quite likely that we either have the best hand or we have very reasonable equity in this situation, just given that I think his shove is bluff heavy. And he does have the ace jack, which is good for us, and we hold up. Pocket 3s in the small blind. Middle position, open raises, who so far seems to be a tight and very aggressive regular. We flat, hoping to hit our set. And we do flop our set. Now we have 3 options available to us here. Recently, I think a lot of the time I do like to donk here. On such a board, 8-6-3 two-tone, we don't necessarily expect the open raiser to be c-betting this board that frequently in general. However, this guy in particular has been c-betting 81%. He also has an aggression factor of 6.6 over 2.2k hands, which is very high. We definitely expect this guy to be barreling, definitely c-betting the flop, and quite possibly barreling the turn, and perhaps even the river, a decent amount of the time. Therefore, while normally we'd prefer to either donk bet here, or perhaps check raise, against a specific player, the option of check calling down becomes more favourable. The reason being, yes, there are some turn cards we don't like as much. For example, we won't be too happy if a spade rolls off. However, we can expect him to barrel these types of hands even if he doesn't hit them. If a spade does roll off on the turn, he may even fire 2 barrels trying to represent the spade. So our plan here is going to be to check call down, and unless the board runs out really terrible, for example, we end up with 4 to a flush on the board, only then will we consider folding. The rest of the time we are pretty much just going to check call down any turns and any rivers. If the river is an okay card for us, then we can perhaps consider check raising for value if we think it's likely he will pay us off. But we decide to check call a flop. The turn comes a 7, which does coordinate the board somewhat. It's easily possible that he can continue barreling on this turn and on the river, however. I see no real reason to raise for value. There are definitely worse hands we might be able to get value from if we do raise here. I just think given this player's tendencies to be aggressive and fire barrels, it's going to be higher EV in the long run to call the turn and either raise or call the river. And the river comes a 9, which is a bad card in that it puts a 4 to straight on the board. However, it's more than likely this player is capable of betting the river also as a bluff. The only downside really to this river card is it means we can't really raise for value anymore when he shoves or bets. But there are plenty of cards he might be doing this with. If he has a hand like Ace-Jack of Spades, he's definitely betting the flop and quite possibly the turn. And this is actually a good river card for him to bluff. There aren't too many hands we can have that we're comfortable calling with on this 4 to straight board unless we ourselves have a 10x. And given how we played this hand, he's never going to put us on a hand like pocket 3s or something like pocket 6s or pocket 8s, because in his mind we are going to be either check raising the flop or check raising the turn pretty much always. We've only played it like this because we think he's capable of perhaps firing a big value bet, river bet as a bluff even. He does bet over 2/3 pot. We can never raise here, as discussed. We make the call. We are pretty much bluff catching at this stage. It's very unlikely he's ever value betting a hand that's worse than a straight. If he has a hand like 7-8 or 8-9, he's never value betting here, because we are pretty much only going to be calling with a straight a lot of the time, or perhaps a set, except he doesn't really think we ever have sets in our range. And he does end up having the ace-king. So if we had check raised at any point in this hand, it is quite possible he would have folded his naked overcards. Therefore, given the stats we've collected on this player so far, that he is very aggressive, we were able to take a slightly non-standard line to maximize our value. We have pocket aces in the cutoff, and under the gun open raises, and under the gun is playing 57-22 and is quite possibly a fish. Given that he has a low fold to 3-bet, we are going to 3-bet here for value. He does call, and the flop comes Queen 9-3. There are plenty of worse hands he can continue with here. He can have any Queen X, any 9x, he can have any heart draw, he can have a hand like 10-Jack or King-Jack. We definitely want to bet here for value with the intention of shoving the turn. The turn is pretty much a blank, so we are going to proceed with our plan of shoving the turn for value and hope he can call with a Queen X or a 9x or some of his draws. And he does call us with pocket 6s, which is somewhat surprising. It's quite a bad call in my opinion. To make this kind of call, he is really putting us on a draw ourselves if we wanted to play aggressively on the turn, such as a flush draw ourselves or a hand like 10-Jack ourselves. Ace King on the button. The cutoff open raises. He is playing quite tightly so far. Given that he has a low fold to 3-bet, we could definitely consider raising for value. I decide to flat, possibly because there are short stack players in the blinds. One is less than half stacked, one is just over half stacked. Also, the player in the big blinds seems to be quite 3-bet happy. It's possible he is going to squeeze. So I decide to flat on the button. If the big blind does make a 3-bet here, then we are going to be more than happy to get the money in with our Ace King. The player in the small blind shoves. The other two players fold. I think given that this player is probably a fish and he can be quite wide here, I wouldn't be surprised if he had a hand like Ace Jack. Sometimes he may have a hand like pocket fives. I think it's quite likely versus his range as a whole we are probably in good shape. Perhaps he even has some random hands like 7-8 suited or 10 Jack. I think given that we have Ace King, we have to make this call here. If this was a full-sized shove and we had reason to suspect this player wasn't bad, then we could consider folding here. Most of the time, against shoves that are less than 100 big blinds, a hand like Ace King is going to be the nuts and you shouldn't be folding. Even if the player that shoves is a slight favourite with a hand like pocket fives, it's still often correct to get the money in because of the dead money in the pot, even though you are getting in as a very slight underdog. Queen King offsuit in the small blind. The button open raises, and it seems that he is playing quite loosely from the button, opening 70% of hands so far from the button. Queen King is definitely ahead of his button opening range. We decide to flat. We could definitely consider making a thin value bet here with King Queen, given that this player on the button is not folding much to 3-bets either, but he is also 4-betting a decent amount, and we don't really want to get 4-bet off our King Queen should the button have a hand like King 6 suited and turn it into a bluff. And we are obviously dominating such hands, but we are pretty much forced to fold to a 4-bet with this type of hand. Therefore we flat, given that we expect to be comfortably ahead of his range with a hand like Queen King. We do flop trips with second kicker. If this was a board with a flush draw, for example the King of Clubs, 7 of Clubs, King of Spades, I definitely may consider donking. This is because in general donking is going to look slightly weaker than check raising, and there is also a flush draw that people can call with. Given that there is no draw out there, it's difficult for either of these players to continue with a lot of their hands. This is definitely a good spot to slow play and hope either of these players can maybe bet a hand like pocket tens for protection, or maybe even bluff, or bet a hand like Ace Jack or Ace Queen. Our plan is pretty much to check call down and hope the player on the button is capable of firing multiple barrels, perhaps with some bluff type hands. Given the river card, which is the 2 of the hearts, and the turn card, which is the 8 of diamonds, the deuce of hearts is more or less a blank. We could consider raising here for value. It is on the thin side. It's not as if we have the absolute nuts here. If the button did have a hand like King 7 or King 8, we know he's raising wide from the button, so these hands are possible. Maybe even a King Deuce. Perhaps even a pocket 7s or pocket 8s type hands. then we are obviously losing. Also, if he does have a hand like pocket tens and we raise here, he's not necessarily going to call a raise with a hand like pocket tens, whereas if he has a hand like ace king or king 7, he's obviously going to be snap calling a raise. So we do expect to have the best hand a reasonable amount of the time here. Raising for value might be thin, just because he's going to fold some of the weaker hands in his range. Perhaps he even folds a hand like king 5 to a raise here, because he doesn't see how we can really be raising worse for value, and he doesn't think we're going to be bluffing on this river. So although we have the best hand a big amount of the time, raising for value is thin, because he is going to be folding a lot of the hands that we beat, and we are going to lose money the time he has a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 8s. Although if he had filled up, I do think perhaps he's betting slightly bigger on this river. He bets just over half pot. We flatten, he has the king 9. So even with a hand as strong as king 9, it's debatable whether he will actually call a river raise. I don't think it would even be a good play for him to call a river raise with a hand like king 9 here, just because I don't think he can think we're bluffing. There's not really any busted draws we can have, and it's unlikely we're raising worse for value. That doesn't mean he's definitely not going to call with a hand like king 9. He may find it difficult to lay down a hand like king 9, but I don't think for him to call with a hand like king 9 to a river raise here would be a good play, and therefore I'm not going to raise expecting him to call with this hand. We pick up pocket kings in middle position. Under the gun, open raises. Under the gun is less than half stacked. He hasn't been folding to 3-bet so far. He's been 3-bet twice and hasn't folded. It's possible he is slightly stronger given that he's opening under the gun. I'm definitely going to put in a 3-bet value here. And he does jam, and given that we have pocket kings, it's a pretty easy decision. He has queens and we hold up, which is always nice. King jack suited under the gun. We make a min raise, which is a play I do make from time to time. The plan is really to isolate this fish in the big blind. He does call. We do end up flopping trips. We definitely want to c-bet this board. There are hands he can call with, like he may have a 9x type hand. He may have any flush draw. Perhaps he has some worse king x hands. Perhaps he has a hand like jack queen or 10 jack, or that he doesn't want to fold, or even maybe a hand like ace jack or ace queen that he doesn't want to fold. Although, given that he's been 3-betting quite actively so far, we can definitely discount some of the stronger pre-flop holdings from his range. I don't think he's necessarily going to be flatting these hands just because we are opening under the gun. He does make a min raise, which is strange. First of all, given that this player is quite possibly a fish, it can be difficult to narrow their range too substantially. This could definitely be a made hand, like a 9x or a king x. He could also be semi-bluffing some of his draws, if he has any 2 clubs, or a hand like jack queen or 10 jack. I think he's capable of doing this, even though it's not necessarily a great play. He will occasionally have us beat, although not too often. I think it's probably fine to put in a raise here for value. I do decide to flat. The advantage of flatting is, since he has taken the initiative from us, it does now allow him to barrel certain turns and rivers. With a worse hand, or a draw, perhaps if he has a 9x type hand, or a 10 jack or jack queen, he can continue barreling. If he has a king x type hand, I definitely expect him to barrel the turn and river. He bets very small on the turn. I don't think this is ever going to be a King X. I think he likely bets a lot bigger with a King X. This could easily be one of his draw type hands that hasn't improved on that turn, like Jack Queen or Jack 10. Could also be a 9x type hand, or perhaps any other pair if he has them, like pocket 8s, which he wanted to check raise for protection on the flop, perhaps. Against this weak range, and also possibly a range that is going to continue to erase, I don't expect this player to fold his draws. I definitely think raising here is a good option. And the river comes the 8 of spades, which is a reasonably safe card. He does have some one pair type hands in his range. He does have some busted draws also. I think it's unlikely he has a worse King X just from his turn bet sizing. I bet half pot, which is fine. There's no point shoving here because I just don't think he's necessarily going to manage to find a call with his 9x type hands, or perhaps even pocket 10s. Although again, I think he's probably raising a hand like pocket 10s or pocket jacks or queens pre-flop. So a lot of the time this is either going to be a 9x or a hand like pocket 5s when he calls here. And he has the ace 9, which is fine. Pocket kings in the big blind. The player in middle position open raises. We don't know too much about him so far, apart from he is short stacked. He opens to 5x. The button, who seems to be a fairly tight regular, makes the call. And given that he isn't folding to 3-bets too often, and also given the fact that we don't mind getting the money in against a player that opens in middle position, we are going to 3-bet for value. And he shoves, so it's a pretty standard call. Ace King on the button. This is 20 NL. We decide to flat call after the cutoff open raises. We definitely could 3-bet for value here. However, we don't know too much about how the cutoff is responding to 3-bets, so flatting's fine. Also, there is a half stack in the big blind. We flop top pair, top kicker on a very dry board. And this player leads out. And this player calls. We could definitely consider flatting and slow playing this hand against 2 players, just because the board is so dry. Given the fact that we are committed against the player who is short stacked, and given the fact that this regular quite possibly has some type of hand when he makes his call, either of these players could have an ace-x type hand. I think our best option is to raise for value. And we do raise, and this player calls. The regular player folds. Our plan is pretty much to shove any turn. There aren't too many turn cards we're really that worried about. The 6 of diamonds is definitely not one of them. This player has a hand like ace 10 or ace jack. He's definitely not folding to a turn shove here, given his stack size. And he has the ace jack, which is fine. Ace jack in middle position. It's a fairly standard open raise. The player in the big blind makes the call. He is half stacked. We do flop top pair. This player hasn't been folding to c-bets so far. He's folded once out of 3 opportunities. We definitely want to be c-betting here for value, and we are going to be firing safe turn cards. 4 of clubs is definitely a safe turn card. We want to bet again for value. He can definitely call with some worse jacks, some draws like 10 queen, maybe some 9x type hands. And he does raise, which is unfortunate. If this player was sitting deep, then we would definitely have to fold here. However, given that he has so little behind, firstly, it's going to be less of a mistake for us to get the money in, and secondly, we can perhaps expect his range to be slightly wider here, just because, given that he's short stacked, he really needs to commit slightly lighter. So it's just a case of whether he always has two pair or a set here, or whether, given that he's short, he can definitely be perhaps semi-bluffing, maybe a turn club draw, maybe a hand like 10 queen. Maybe he can do this with a worse jack. Perhaps he can have king jack or jack queen here some of the time. And these type of hands should appear in his range slightly more often, just due to the fact that he needs to commit lighter because he doesn't have a full stack. I don't think he's ever folding, given that he's check raised, so I decide to just jam over the top, hope perhaps he has a worse jack or he's semi-bluffing. And he has a jack 10, so it works out fine. If this player was sitting 100 big blinds deep, I don't think he's ever check raising the turn with a hand as weak as 10 jack. The button open raises, we are in the small blind with pocket 10s. I decide to flat, which is fine. We could consider 3-betting, although if we do 3-bet, we can't really fold to further action given his stack size. So I decide to flat and evaluate on the flop. We do flop second set, which is obviously great for us. We could consider donking here. However, I think he is c-betting this ace-high board very often. It's probably a better idea to donk in this situation if you think the player is not going to c-bet, either because they haven't hit the board or because it's not a good board for them to c-bet, or they don't like to c-bet very often. Given that he has c-bet 100% out of 3 opportunities so far, and given that this is a okay board to c-bet, I definitely think he is c-betting, so I check to him. Again, I choose to check call. I definitely could check raise here for value, to get value from ace-x type hands, maybe any flush draws, maybe jack king, jack queen. I decide to play it this way mainly because we're shallow, and I do expect him to also bet the turn a reasonable amount of the time. The turn brings another flush draw. I do decide now to check raise. Given the amount of money he's invested, I definitely don't think he's getting away from an ace-x type hand, perhaps even a 10x type hand, and quite possibly he is not folding any of his flush draws. The river comes the ace of spades, although we can never fold at this point given the amount of money invested and that he has just under $4 behind. It's unlikely he's now folding any type of ace-x hand. We definitely want to bet for value. We don't want to allow him to check back. And somehow he shows up with the queen king, so it's quite difficult for him to make that river call with king high. But this is exactly the type of hand that he is probably going to be checking back, and that he might call with if we bet, although I wouldn't necessarily expect him to ever be calling with king high here, especially given we check raise the turn. It's very likely we have some type of made hand. Although he obviously felt he was priced in to calling just in case we were bluffing, perhaps with a hand like jack queen or king jack, or any two spades or hearts that don't have a pair, although the spades get there on the river also. pocket jacks in the big blinds. The cutoff open raises, the button calls. We could consider 3-betting for value here. Given that we are slightly deep against both of these players, I decide to flat. This is the kind of board you do want to consider donking when you flop your set. The reason being, if either of these players don't like the board, they are not going to bet. The open raiser is not going to c-bet this board unless he likes it. Also, the board is very drawy. We don't want to give either of these players the opportunity to check back some of their draws. It's definitely a good spot to donk bet. When we get raised here by this player who seems like he might be quite fishy, and therefore can definitely be raising some worse hands, perhaps some weak over pairs like pocket queens, or a hand like ace jack, or perhaps anything with a draw, anything with a diamond draw, maybe a hand like 9-10 of diamonds, or 7-8, or 10 queen of diamonds, or just the naked 10 queen. Either way, we don't really want him to be seeing a cheap turn or river card when we can re-raise on the flop, and he is likely to continue. And he does flat, which is likely going to be a drawing type hand. The turn isn't that great a card for us, although we don't necessarily expect him to have an 8 that often. He may sometimes have an 8, but it's difficult for him to really raise a lot of his 8x type hands on the flop, unless they also have some type of diamond draw, or if they are specifically 8-10, and if he has flopped the nuts with a hand like 8-10, that's just unfortunate. I do decide to shove this river, which I think is okay. I still think there are many hands he can call with. I think this can sometimes look quite bluffy. I think he can still possibly call with a flush draw, or possibly bluff catch with some of his 2-pair type hands. Sometimes he will have an 8, in which case we still have reasonable equity. If the board pairs, then we have the best hand. He may even himself have a hand like pocket 7s or pocket 9s, in which case it's still going to be difficult for him to fold here. He does end up having the 8-10, which is unfortunate. We still, however, have some equity, and we miss on the river. So I'm happy with how I played that hand. I think it's just pretty much a caller when he flops the nuts against our top set. We are obviously on to the biggest losers. Here we decide to flat king 10 suited. We are in position and the pot looks like it's going to be multi-way. Given that the original open raiser does not c-bet, and this player who's playing 45-8 could also take a stab if he had a hand like ace-x or queen-x, I do think we could definitely fire this flop. I do decide to check back, but I do think betting's fine. I think either of these players can be folding a reasonable amount of time. We do, however, turn the nuts. This player leads out, this player calls, and we definitely want to raise to get value from any 2-pair type hands, any flush draws, any 1-card straight draws that can perhaps counterfeit our hand. We raise, this player calls, and the player in the middle who flatted now decides to make a small re-raise. So it's a very strange line. I don't expect him to be doing this without a very strong hand. I think it's quite possible he has the king 10 himself, or at the very least a hand like pocket jacks. I think king 10 is probably his most likely holding. We decide to shove, given the dead money in the pot, and given the fact that this player may call also. The only hand we're really that worried about is a hand like King 10 of Diamonds, which is pretty much free rolling us. All other hands we have excellent equity against. This player does end up having Ace Queen, and this player has a 10 King, so we are chopping with this player. And we just need to dodge 4 outs on the river. And he does somehow manage to catch his ace, which is unfortunate. But we played the hand fine. Pocket Kings. Under the gun, open raises. 2 players call. Given the amount of money in the pot, it's definitely a good idea to make a large squeeze here. It's a lot more likely one of these players is going to call, just given the dead money in the pot. The player in middle position calls, and he's been playing 57-22 so far. It's quite likely a fish. And this player in the cutoff calls also. And he can perhaps have a slightly wider range because he's now getting even better odds to call when this player tags along. So he can definitely have some lower pocket pairs and some suited connectors type hands in his range. The flop comes 3-4-5, and I definitely want to bet this board. I do decide to overbet jam, which I think is okay. I definitely think the player in middle position is not going to be folding a hand like pocket 8s here, or pretty much any type of draw. I may even get called with some type of ace-x hand here for the gut shot. I do get called by the player in the cutoff, who has unfortunately flopped the nuts. However, I do think this hand was played fine. It's just a question of whether betting small on the flop is going to be a higher EV play in the long run. Queen King suited from the big blind after under the gun open raises. We decide to flat, which is by no means a standard flat, although this player is not c-betting the flop too often, so we are likely to see free turn and river cards some of the time. Given that we have a monster draw on this flop, I definitely think donking is quite possibly the best play. However, given the fact that this player has only been c-betting 45% of the time, he is probably checking back a reasonable amount of the time, and we can therefore see free turn cards. So I choose to do this, and when we make our king high flush, we want to bet for value. The river comes a pretty safe card. We have the second nuts here, we definitely want to bet for value. And we do get raised. So the only hand we're really scared of here is an ace-x of diamonds type hand. He can quite possibly be raising a worse flush for value if he has a hand like 7-8 of diamonds. I think it's quite likely he will raise the size for value out of any straight or 2-pair hand. The main question we have to answer is, should we re-raise here for value? And I think quite possibly it is a good idea. I definitely don't think he's folding a worse diamond draw. I do decide to shove, which I think's fine. You could decide to raise smaller if you think he's the type of player that is ever going to fold an 8 high diamond draw here or something. But I think he can even expect us to be perhaps shoving a hand like Jack King here for value, maybe even, given that he didn't raise the turn. So he may think that he's not representing a flush that strongly. But I think if you don't expect him to fold an 8 high flush draw here, then shoving for value is going to be fine, and he does end up having the ace-5 of diamonds, which is unfortunate, but I also think it's a bit of a cooler. We can never fold the river to his raise, it's just a case of whether we want to re-raise again for value. Under the gun opens, and I think he's quite possibly a fish, and we have pocket kings, and he's possibly not folding to a 3-bet. So far he has folded 0 times, and he's been 3-bet 6 times, and he hasn't folded once even. Therefore we definitely want to 3-bet for value. The flop comes 3-3-2. It's pretty unlikely he's hit this board. It's unlikely he has a 3 or a 2 in his open raising range. He can have plenty of hands that have overpairs to this board, like pocket 5s, pocket 8s, pocket 10s. He can also have hands like ace jack or ace 10, which he may even be floating once whiz on the flop. There's no need to bet too big therefore on the flop. We do want to induce calls from a hand like ace jack or 10 jack, whatever he wants to float with. The turn comes a 2, and I do decide to overbet shove here, which I think's fine. I made this play for several reasons. One, I don't think he's ever folding a hand like pocket 8s here, because just as we don't expect him to have any 3s or 2s in his under the gun opening range, he can't really expect us to have any 3s or 2s in our 3-betting range versus an under the gun open. Therefore, when we shove here, it may look pretty bluffing. I also think, given the fact that the board has paired, he's now much less likely to fold an ace high type hand. He shouldn't actually be any less likely to fold it. The reason why people don't fold ace high on paired boards is because when the board is double paired, any pocket pair below the 2 pairs on the board are now counterfeited. So for example, if this board was 10-10-9-9 and someone had pocket 8s, then obviously ace high wins. When the 2 pairs on the board are the lowest 2 possible pairs, no actual hands have been counterfeited, so you definitely shouldn't be more likely to call with a hand like pocket aces here. But I think a lot of players may mistakenly assume that now the board's paired that they should be calling down with ace high more often, which in general you should be, but not on a 3-3 deuce deuce board. I decide to shove for value. Perhaps he can even bluff catch with some types of hands. And he does have jacks, and I don't expect him really to ever be folding jacks anyway, however much I bet. And he does hit his 4% river, which is unfortunate, but we got the money in good. Here the button open raises to 3x. The player in the small blind, who has been 3-betting quite frequently so far, decides to 3-bet. The player on the button has also been stealing from the button quite often so far. We can therefore expect the small blind player here to be light a large amount of the time. And this was the reasoning behind me making the 4-bet here. However, in retrospect, I do think just because the small blind is light, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea to cold 4-bet with ace king for value. Just because ace king is pretty much crushing his range for 3-betting in the small blind, that doesn't mean he is going to continue with a good part of that range to my cold 4-bet, which does look super strong. Generally people do not cold 4-bet as bluffs ever, which is why sometimes it's a good strategy to cold 4-bet bluff, because people expect you to have value hands at the micros. If I had a hand like king 6 suited here, I definitely think this is a good spot to 4-bet as a bluff against this player, because the button is wide a decent amount of the time, the small blind is wide a decent amount of the time, and when we cold 4-bet we are not wide at all because people don't cold 4-bet bluff. So this is an excellent spot to cold 4-bet bluff. Given that we have a value hand, I think our best option is going to be to flat against the small blind in position and hope he fires some c-bets on the flop. In other words, we generate too much fold equity here for it to be profitable for us to raise for value. The button decides to shove, which is unfortunate. The reason being, as said, our range here looks very, very strong. Therefore, when the button decides to shove all in over the top of our cold 4-bet, Ace-King is not actually even in very great shape against his shoving range here. If we look in the top left, we see that we are getting 1.68 to 1 on a call. And this means we need to have 37% equity against his range to make the call. So if we bring up a copy of Poker Stove, we know that perhaps if we assume that he can maybe jam a hand like pocket queens, which he can't necessarily, he may be flatting a hand like pocket queens, maybe once in a while a hand like ace-king suited, maybe ace-king off. So if we say his range for jamming here is queens plus and ace-king off plus, which it may not even be that wide, and we know what our hand is, which is the ace of hearts and the king of spades, not that the suits really matter, we can see that we have 38% equity against his range here, which means that given we need 37%, we do actually have the odds to call. However, if he's not shoving a hand like ace-king or ace-king off here, or pocket queens, and it may seem tight, but in this particular spot versus a cold 4-bet, some people's range is really going to be aces and kings only. Let's say queens once in a while, but not ace-king. We can now see we actually only have 30% against a range of queens plus. Therefore, if we think this player is only shoving here with a hand as strong as queens plus, or maybe even kings plus, we actually do not have the odds to call here with ace-king, despite the fact that we have 4-bet. And he does end up having pocket kings, which doesn't really give us any information. We obviously expect him to be shoving a hand like pocket kings, whereas if he'd shown up with a hand like queens or ace-king here, we'd know his range was wider. Whereas given the fact that he has pocket kings, his range may literally be kings plus, in which case this was a minus EV call. Which seems strange because you don't expect to ever 4-bet a hand like ace-king and then have to fold to a jam. But this is the downside of 4-betting a hand for value in a spot where in some ways you're actually over-representing your hand because the line you are taking looks so strong. They can't really ever shove a worse hand because they expect you to have perhaps kings or aces so much of the time. Pocket jacks in the big blinds. It's limped round to us, and we definitely want to make a raise here for value. We make it 4x, which is fine. We definitely could consider raising slightly larger, perhaps to 5x. This player limp calls, and the flop's a good board for a c-bet. We may have the best hand a reasonable amount of the time. We don't expect him to fold a king x, but he may well be folding a hand like pocket sevens or any of his complete whiffs. He calls, so his range possibly looks like king x hands, maybe some floats, maybe some flush draws. When we do hit the jack on the turn, we pretty much expect to have the best hand almost always. The only thing that really beats us is a hand like pocket kings, which he's quite possibly not limp calling pre-flop. I do, however, think he is going to be firing this turn with a lot of his range if we check to him. It's a good board for him to float on. He may also bet some of his King X hand for value. He may bet his pure floats. In fact, he's definitely betting his pure floats. And he may well semi-bluff his flush draws. Therefore, this is a good spot to check raise, because I don't think this player is a good player necessarily, given that he open limped pre-flop, and therefore I don't think he realizes he should necessarily be folding some of his draws to a raise here. Although we do make it quite small, I do prefer a slightly bigger check raise to really charge his draws. We are almost pricing him in with the raise size that I made. He does jam over the top, and it's a pretty easy decision. There is only one hand that beats us, pocket kings. Therefore, we are definitely calling this shove. And he has the pocket sixes, which means he is drawing to one out. And there is his out on the river. So I remember that hand actually. That was a pretty sick hand. I almost smashed my keyboard. But that's how it goes. You can't really be worried about the results of the hand. We obviously got the money in great shape. The fact that the 6 came on the river is completely irrelevant. It shouldn't worry us in the slightest. We are only concerned with making the best possible plays. Here with pocket kings against the under the gun open raiser, he hasn't been raising too wide. He has been playing a fair amount of hands, but not necessarily open raising a wide range. He hasn't been folding to 3-bets, although he's only been 3-bet once. It's definitely possible he is continuing here. The board comes Queen 8-4, and we definitely want to bet for value. He's not folding the Queen X hand. He can continue with a hand like 9-10, 9-Jack. Perhaps he's calling one time with a hand like pocket 9s, pocket 10s, or an 8-X type hand. Perhaps he can even have some of the 5-6 or 5-7 type draws. He does decide to donk, however, and I think this means he's likely connected with the board in some way. I don't necessarily think there are a lot of hands that beat us. I think there are more hands he can be value owning himself with, like Queen X hands, or semi-bluffs like 9-10 or 9-Jack. The hands we are really worried about are pocket 8s and pocket 4s. I think this player is quite capable of even 4-betting a hand like queens pre-flop in this particular spot. So really, the only hands we're worried about are pocket 8s, pocket 4s, and I think he can be doing this with a wide range of hands. He also has a very high donk bet stat. He's been donk betting over 80% of the time so far. Given that he's very wide here, and I also think any hand with potential is probably not folding, I do decide to jam all in here and hope to get called by a hand like Queen Jack or maybe 9-10. And he does have the pocket 8s, which is unfortunate. Against some players you can get away from this hand. Against this particular player, given that he is capable of being so wide here, we really just need to chalk these type of situations up to a caller. He just happened to have the top of his range in this particular situation. Ace Queen suited in the big blind. The player in the small blind open raises, and I'm not sure exactly how the dynamic at the table was. I'm pretty sure I had a read that this player was pretty much spewing money around the table. He didn't like to fold to anything. And given that I have a hand as strong as Ace Queen suited, given the fact that he has open raise to 11x here, and even after he's done this, I think I'm ahead of his range. I think he's probably not folding whatever he's doing this with, and I think my best play is just to shove here and hope he can call with worse. And he does end up having the 7-2 V. So I think he is possibly getting coaching from Tom Dwan. It is very difficult to get all in pre-flop with a hand like 7 deuce suited and hit a full house on the river. But what can I say? I think I probably just got owned. So I think that's it for today. Thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. This was the last of the hand history reviews. We have, in the remaining 3 videos, I think we are going to possibly have a leak finder series where I review someone's play, and then we will probably have 2 videos of session reviews, again this time on 25NL, if all goes to plan. So thanks very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video. This has been Weasel making a video for Hold'em.ro. See you guys soon.